There was a chapter in human history so brutal that surviving past the age of 12 counted as a full life. Being human in that era wasn't a privilege. It was closer to a curse. Picture waking up on an ordinary morning with exactly one job for the entire day. Don't die. If you managed to hang on until your 13th birthday, you'd already outlived most of your own kind. That life wasn't lived by some anonymous figure lost to time. It was lived by one of your actual ancestors, someone who fought through that era and won, which is the only reason any of us exist to tell the story now. Let's start with how we even found out any of this happened. On November 4th, 1960, in Tanzania, a 20-year-old man was digging through the dirt at a site called Olduvai Gorge under a brutal African sun. His name was Jonathan Leakey, and he was working alongside his parents, the scientists Lewis and Mary Leakey, who had spent years searching these gorges for clues about our origins. That afternoon, something in the ground caught his eye. A fragment of a jawbone, 13 teeth still lodged inside it. They kept digging. 2 pieces of skull came up next, then 21 small bones from a hand and fingers, all from the same patch of soil. When they pieced the skeleton together, the finger structure looked remarkably human, close, but not quite a match to our own hands. Lewis Leakey brought in a team of specialists to figure out exactly what they'd found and what its story might be. The first breakthrough came from potassium-argon dating, a technique precise enough to tell them this creature had died roughly 1.8 million years ago. Then the jaw offered a second clue. The teeth hadn't finished developing. No wisdom teeth had come in yet. The wrist bones told the same story. The growth plates hadn't fully hardened into mature bone. Every signal pointed to the same conclusion. This individual had died somewhere around 11 or 12 years old, and yet the hand told a very different story about capability. The thumb could touch the pads of the other fingers, the same grip humans use for fine motor tasks, including tool-making. A hand built for skilled, complex work usually belongs to a creature with a brain to match. So the team turned their attention to a large curved piece of skull called the parietal bone. It confirmed a brain size somewhere between 600 and 710 cubic centimeters, nearly double a chimpanzee's average of 400 cubic centimeters, though still far below our own 1,350 cubic centimeters. Then came a second find that sealed the identification. Another skeleton of the same species, catalogued as OH8, this time with an intact foot. The foot structure suggested a height of only 3 to 4 feet, and its architecture was sophisticated enough to confirm this really was a branch of the human family tree. Scientists named the species Homo habilis, meaning handy, a nod to hands capable of skilled work. But the pattern held. This second skeleton had also died somewhere between 10 and 14 years old. So who was this creature? And why did its story keep ending the same way, over and over, at the edge of adolescence? For decades, the mystery deepened rather than resolved. As more Homo habilis remains turned up across different sites, the collection grew. By the early 2000s, researchers had gathered more than 24 skeletal specimens. Eventually, a team decided it was time to study them together as a single dataset, hoping the bigger picture would reveal something the individual bones couldn't. A paleoanthropologist who had spent her career mastering 3 highly specialized skills led the effort, reading bone and body structure to understand the relationship between early humans and our ape ancestors, analyzing microscopic wear on fossilized teeth to reconstruct diet, environment, and age, and taphonomy, the science of extracting information from remains that are millions of years old, essentially performing an autopsy on the deep past. Working with colleagues, she gathered 116 permanent teeth from 20 different Homo habilis individuals sourced from East Africa and began a detailed analysis. How do you determine someone's age from teeth that are 1.8 million years old? The answer comes down to a few overlapping techniques. First, enamel wears down at a fairly predictable rate over a lifetime. The same reason an older animal's teeth look yellower than a younger one's, as the enamel thins and the yellow dentin underneath starts to show through. Researchers use known wear rates, roughly 2.21 millimeters per year for canines, 0.61 millimeters per year for other teeth, and adjust them for this specific species. Second, chewing leaves microscopic scratches on the surfaces of teeth, and the density of those scratches under a microscope correlates with age. Finally, all of this gets cross-checked against dietary and demographic patterns from other early human populations, calibrated against the environmental record of that time period, and run through computational models for verification. What came out of that analysis was something nobody in the field had fully reckoned with before. The average age at death across the 20 samples was 12.8 years. Most individuals died between 10 and 14. Only one sample reached 25. Not a single one made it to 30. And the numbers were arguably worse than that. 5 additional sets of milk teeth from young children were deliberately excluded from the main calculation, which meant the true sample size was actually 23, not 20. The researchers were also upfront about a deeper problem: selection bias. The only remains that survive 1.8 million years to be discovered are, almost by definition, remains that had time to fossilize properly, which skews toward individuals who were at least somewhat mature. Infants and toddlers whose bones are smaller, more fragile, and less likely to survive intact across geological time are almost certainly underrepresented. If they could be factored in, the true average lifespan might drop even further, possibly into the range of 8 or 9 years old. That's a staggering number to sit with. What kind of world produces a life expectancy like that? What was actually killing them? Generation after generation before they ever reached adulthood. To answer that, we have to go back much further than Homo habilis. Back to the very beginning of the split between us and our closest living relatives. Around 7 million years ago, a creature called Sahelanthropus chidensis walked the earth, the earliest known branching point between the human lineage and chimpanzees, both descending from one shared ancestor. At that point in time, the land that is now Chad, in West Africa, wasn't the arid landscape we associate with the region today. It was lush, green, and dense with forest, close to paradise for the apes living in it. Sahelanthropus itself was small, 3 to 4 feet tall, overwhelmingly ape-like in behavior, living in trees, eating mostly fruit, leaves, nuts, and tubers, perfectly adapted to forest life. Its brain was even smaller than a chimpanzee's, somewhere around 320 to 380 cubic centimeters, and its canine teeth were reduced compared to more aggressive primates, consistent with a plant-heavy diet. Life in the canopy offered real protection. Most predators simply couldn't reach it there. But one detail in the skull hinted at something significant. The opening where the spinal cord connects to the brain, the foramen magnum, sat closer to the center of the skull than it does in other apes, much like it does in humans. That positioning suggests Sahelanthropus could walk upright on 2 legs, at least some of the time, maybe 20% or less. It's one of the earliest physical signs that this lineage was inching, however slowly, towards something new. For millions of years, that arrangement worked. Then the world changed. Starting around 7 to 4 million years ago, shifting tectonic plates cooled the global climate by several degrees. Rainfall dropped. The dense forests that had sheltered these early apes for generations began thinning into open grassland. Oxygen and carbon dioxide levels shifted along with it. The safety of the trees didn't disappear overnight, but it shrank, forcing creatures who had never needed to survive in the open to suddenly face it directly. It's worth pausing here on something important about how evolution actually works. For a long time, the assumption was that evolutionary change happened gradually and steadily. But the fossil record tells a different story, one described by the theory of punctuated equilibrium, which shows that evolution moves in fits and starts, often triggered by exactly this kind of environmental upheaval. Species don't slowly drift into new forms during calm periods. They get forced into rapid change during periods of crisis, or they don't survive the crisis at all. And that's exactly what happened next. Looking at the broader hominin family tree, dozens of ape and early human species appear and then vanish across roughly 40 million years, nearly all of them species that couldn't adapt fast enough to a changing world. By around 2.5 million years ago, Africa had transformed dramatically. Roughly 70% of the continent had become dry savanna. Temperatures had climbed by 5 to 6 degrees. The Pleistocene epoch, the beginning of the Ice Age, had arrived. And into that unforgiving landscape was born a creature seemingly designed by nature to be tested to its absolute limit: Homo habilis, the first member of our own genus, Homo, the branch of the family tree that eventually leads, many steps later, to us. Homo habilis evolved out of the Australopithecus lineage, the genus that represents the single biggest transitional link between ape and human, even though Australopithecus itself didn't survive. It handed off an enormous evolutionary burden to habilis and handed it off at the worst possible moment. Nearly everything about Homo habilis' body worked against it. Compared to modern humans, it stood roughly 35% shorter, barely 4 feet tall, smaller even than its own Australopithecus ancestors. Part of the reason was a biological trade-off. The brain, which had begun growing larger in this lineage, is an extraordinarily expensive organ to run. In a world where food was scarce, keeping the body compact helped free up energy for the brain to keep developing. Brain size did increase, up to around 600 cubic centimeters, about 100 more than its ancestors, but it still wasn't enough to unlock the kind of advanced group hunting, planning, and tool-making that later species like Homo erectus would master. In some ways, that bigger brain became a liability rather than an advantage. It demanded enormous nutritional investment without yet delivering enough survival benefit to justify the cost. Short, weak, not particularly intelligent by the standards of what came later. No claws, no sharp canines, no natural weapons. And its home was a landscape now 70% open terrain, where any predator scanning the horizon could spot it easily. It couldn't even outrun danger. Look at the structure of a Homo habilis foot, and you'll notice something missing. Little to no spring in the arch, the same spring that in modern humans absorbs shock and makes long-distance running efficient. Homo erectus, evolving later, could reportedly run distances up to 45 kilometers without stopping, an almost unbelievable endurance by modern standards. Homo habilis, by contrast, could likely only manage 1 or 2 kilometers before exhaustion, topping out at speeds of maybe 20 to 25 kilometers per hour on its short legs. And in a 10-kilometer radius of its territory, it likely shared space with 6 or 7 highly aggressive predators, many capable of running twice as fast. These weren't ordinary predators either. Modern Africa has 5 or 6 major apex predators. Back then, the number was easily double that, each one a highly specialized killing machine. You might assume the remaining patches of forest still offered some safety. They didn't, not really. Take a look at an actual Homo habilis skull recovered from the fossil record. The right side shows clear signs of trauma, quite possibly from a fallout of a tree. Nature had played a particularly cruel trick on this species. It hadn't fully adapted them for life on the ground, but it hadn't left them fully suited for the trees either. They were stuck in the middle of both worlds, and mastering neither. Look at the hand bones of different hominins side by side, and the pattern becomes clear. Tree-dwelling primates typically have strongly curved finger bones, ideal for gripping branches. Ground-adapted humans have much flatter ones. Homo habilis sits awkwardly in between, not curved enough to climb with real confidence, not flat enough to build tools with full human dexterity. Even their thumb placement splits the difference. Their shoulder blades tell a similar story. Tree-climbing primates have shoulder blades angled upward, ideal for swinging and hanging. Humans have ours angled to the side, which lets our arms hang naturally for efficient running. Homo habilis, again, landed somewhere in between. And where most primates have a long upper body paired with a short lower body, habilis had the reverse, making it an unstable, inefficient climber on top of everything else. It's hard to overstate how disadvantaged that left them, competing for limited fruit in limited trees against thousands of far better adapted primates. While also unable to properly escape ground-based predators, it was, in a sense, the worst possible combination of traits nature could have handed them. So how did a creature this poorly equipped keep its calorie needs met as the forests kept shrinking? The answer traces back to their Australopithecus ancestors, who had already begun incorporating meat, insects, and bone marrow into their diet, eventually making up roughly 1/4 to 1/3 of what Homo habilis ate. Given their size, speed, and lack of weapons, they weren't hunters. They were scavengers, surviving on the leftovers of kills made by other, more capable predators. And this single habit, scavenging, turned out to be the hinge point of the entire story, the moment that would eventually turn a scattered, vulnerable species into the dominant one on the planet. Scavenging isn't a solo activity. It demands locating a carcass, distracting whatever predators are still nearby, stealing a share of the meat under their noses, and escaping safely with it. A sequence of steps, far too risky and complex for one individual to manage alone. It requires a group, more eyes to watch for danger, more hands to grab meat quickly, more bodies for protection, faster, coordinated action. Some researchers believe this is exactly the pressure that pushed early communication forward. Basic vocal signals, gestures, shared understanding between group members. Fossilized skull casts from this era show early development in Broca's area, the region of the brain closely tied to speech and language production, supporting the idea that the demands of group scavenging were shaping the brain in real time. But cooperation came bundled with something far more dangerous: direct competition with animals built to guard their kills. Giant hyenas, dwarfing today's versions, weren't just scavengers themselves, but cunning, coordinated pack hunters, capable of tracking prey over distance, wearing it down, and crushing bones, including bones as large as a mammoth's, with jaw strength that today's hyenas can't come close to matching. Then there was Dinophilus, a saber-toothed cat, roughly 1.5 times the size of a modern leopard, and, by all evidence, a specialized primate hunter. Its long canines weren't built to grip a throat the way a lion's are. They were built to punch straight through skull bone. Fossilized remains of Sahelanthropus, a close cousin of early humans, show matching puncture wounds consistent with exactly that kind of direct skull-piercing attack, sometimes even delivered from an ambush in the trees. Survive that, and there was still Meganterion, another saber-toothed predator, roughly the same intimidating size, with dagger-like canines 4 to 5 inches long, built to strike directly at the throat and sever the carotid artery and windpipe in a single motion, an efficient, almost surgical kill. No prolonged struggle required. Leopards of that era were larger and more capable than the ones alive today. A Homo habilis leg bone recovered from the fossil record shows puncture marks matching leopard teeth almost perfectly. plausible evidence of an individual caught mid-escape, perhaps trying to climb to safety only to be followed straight up the tree. And looming above all of them was the true apex predator of the age, an early cave lion, sometimes called the Mosbach lion, weighing up to 500 kilograms, roughly double the size of a modern lion, immensely muscular, and, worse still, known to hunt in large, disciplined, coordinated groups. Against predators nearly 3 times faster than itself, Homo habilis had essentially no chance in open confrontation. It's also worth remembering this was the Ice Age. Everything alive at the time tended to run larger than its modern equivalent, prey included. Giant buffalo, giant hippos, giant antelope, and outsized ancient moose all shared this same landscape. If the land wasn't safe, and the trees weren't fully safe either, water might have seemed like the obvious retreat. It wasn't. Ancient rivers and lakes were home to enormous crocodiles, some up to 8 meters long and well over a ton in weight, capable of a bite force strong enough to guarantee that once you were caught, there was no escaping, followed by the animal's signature death roll, capable of tearing a limb clean off. Fossilized foot bones from Homo habilis bear deep puncture marks, matching crocodile teeth almost exactly, suggesting these encounters happened with some regularity. Even the sky wasn't neutral ground. Enormous predatory birds, some with wingspans comparable to a grown adult's height, were capable of snatching small primates, including young hominins, a claim supported by the discovery of a young Australopithecus africanus skull bearing talon marks consistent with exactly this kind of aerial attack. Giant vultures, several meters across, circled the same skies. Ground, tree, water, sky, every direction held a version of the same threat, and Homo habilis, with a body built more like a small, vulnerable child than a survivor, had to face all of it at once. So how does this story end, and why does it still matter to us now? The leading theory holds that intense evolutionary pressure eventually pushed a branch of Homo habilis to evolve into Homo erectus. For a stretch of roughly 400,000 years, the two species may have coexisted in the same territory, but Homo erectus steadily outcompeted its predecessor in size, brain capacity, physical ability, and technology. A less widely accepted theory suggests the two were actually cousins descending from a shared Australopithecus ancestor rather than one directly evolving from the other. Either way, one fact remains solid. Homo habilis represents the very first spark of what would become the human species, and Homo erectus was the fire that carried that spark forward, eventually mastering the control of fire itself and becoming the first hominins to migrate beyond Africa entirely, carrying the lineage forward into the world. It's worth sitting with that for a moment. The threats our earliest ancestors faced weren't deadlines or difficult bosses or traffic. They were animals, built with teeth twice the size of a modern lion's, in a world with almost no margin for error. And still, that fragile, undersized, poorly adapted little creature survived, not through strength, but through intelligence, cooperation, and the earliest sparks of shared knowledge. The first crude tool shaped by hand, the first controlled flame, the first hunt carried out together instead of alone. We are quite literally descended from the ones who figured it out, the ones who cooperated instead of scattering, who thought their way through a world that offered them almost nothing else to work with.